The purpose of this video is to promote a recent posting on www.ecofascism.com entitled "The Dictatorship of the Landlords, the Green Roots of the Housing Crisis." Researching that posting involved reading over 2,000 pages of literature, recently published literature from the pro-market think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute. These groups advocate deregulation, privatization, and limited government in general. Such groups focus primarily on taxation, education, energy, healthcare policy, much less so on land issues and housing. Nevertheless, certain truths they convey about the housing crisis are found nowhere else. The posting lists 21 choice quotes about land economics. Here's one. This one is from the long-serving former central banker from New Zealand. "The affordability of housing is overwhelmingly a function of just one thing: the extent to which governments restrict artificially the supply of residential land." There is a consensus within that community, well-deserved, that housing unaffordability is the result of land rationing. In economic terms, rising demand does not necessarily increase prices. If supply is elastic, rising demand will simply summon more supply and prices will stabilize. In land markets or housing markets where the supply is restricted, then you will see rising prices accompanying rising demand. If land functioned in a proper market, increased demand would simply cause new housing to be built on newly developed land. While land price inflation has benefited some people, it is a policy catastrophe predicated on the suppression of new wealth creation. High land prices cause poverty, overcrowding, unaffordable housing, restricted labor mobility, reduced discretionary spending, low home ownership rates, antiquated and ill-situated housing stock, and retarded economic growth. The free market community's consensus founders on the question of who benefits from and who is driving the restrictive land use policies. Landlordism is this sphere around which urban containment revolves. However, prejudices within the free market community prevent them from really looking at this sphere directly. The principal opponents, the empowered ones in any event, of the free market movement's agenda are these large residential and commercial landlords. However, that community receives less than 0.1% of the free market movement's attention. They dare not name their own devil. Every country has its House of Lords. It's landlord, homeowner, farmers associations. That milieu is always internally conflicted, but it has a common aim of higher land prices, higher rents. They disguise the land rationing that is going on. They posture as being pro-market only if that market is contained within a terrarium of their design. The landlord versus entrepreneur war is ancient. That polarity drove both the French and the American revolutions. Absent aristocratic vigilance, pilgrims will flock to the frontier. Similarly, absent landlord vigilance, landlordism itself would go the way of serfdom. Hence the passion for conserving land. Conservationism is a 19th century narrative crafted to depict the confinement of tenants as a progressive program aimed at the common good. Conservationism entered the 1960s as a social movement comprising several thousand integrated non-government organizations spread across the Western world. Those organizations were founded generations earlier by very well-heeled men who also managed to embed conservationism into academia and various government departments. During the 1960s, the conservation movement rebranded itself as environmentalism, in part to shed affiliations with fascism and in part to conceal its own upper-class identity. Trendy NGOs like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace appeared at the time to give conservationism a radical veneer. New beachheads were established in the state at this time, but beyond that, it was landlord-centered corporatism as before. Conservationists oppose both the expansion of farmland into wilderness areas and the urbanization of farmland. Farmland scarcity is a complete myth. The USA has 90 million acres of urban land, over 900 million acres of agricultural land. A mere 15 million acres of underutilized pasture is sufficient land to provide every household in America with a brand new house, and it would not cause a blip in food prices. Urbanization poses zero threat to the food supply. The USA is 97% rural and open land. Canada and Australia are 99% rural and open land. The very conservationists who are preaching farmland scarcity are also very actively involved in suppressing the expansion of farmland, which is hypocritical. If it was such a rare thing, then maybe we should add more. They're also very actively involved in converting existing farmland back into bushland. There's a single environmental organization by the name of Ducks Unlimited that has taken out of production about 50,000 square kilometers of potentially prime agricultural land. That's about 20,000 square miles in the North American prairie area. These mosquito-infested sloughs that they are defending, that they have actually now conserved, cover an area almost twice the size of all of Britain's agricultural land. The British Columbia's agricultural land reserve sequesters 47,000 square kilometers east of metropolitan Vancouver. The reserve's rationale is saving the farmer. When the enabling legislation passed in 1973, the province's legislature building witnessed the largest and angriest demonstration in the province's history. And who were the demonstrators? Well, they were the farmers who just lost their right to subdivide. The BC government was praised by the mass media, of course. Farmland scarcity was a very hot topic back in 1973. England's urban green belts span 16,000 square kilometers. That is 13% of England's land mass. Green belts dwarf the cities they surround. London's green belt is 3 times larger than London is itself. This land in the green belt is mostly inaccessible and completely unremarkable farmland. 4% of London's green belt is within 800 meters of a railway station. Just eliminating the green belt designation on that 4% would provide enough land for 1 million houses. In southeastern England, land zoned green belt sells for about $9,000 a hectare. Land zoned residential, which is a stone throw away for some of this greenbelt land, sells for closer to $5 million a hectare. Curiously, 26 of the world's 29 most severely unaffordable cities are in the Anglosphere: the USA, UK, Canada, Australia, etc. All 5 major Australian cities, 2 largest cities in Canada, 13 major American and 7 major British cities, often the largest cities, are severely unaffordable. Sydney, Australia, to take one example, is now the world's 2nd least affordable city. The land economics are thus: farmland on the outskirts of Sydney, Australia, costs about $1,500 per housing lot. Utilities, basic infrastructure, streets, water, costs about $50,000 per housing lot, per housing unit. The actual cost of construction of a house in Sydney right now, less than $120,000. Thus, a house could be profitably built on the outskirts of Sydney for around $170,000. The average house in Sydney right now costs $670,000. That difference, that extra $500,000, is entirely the result of land restriction. You can't build that house on the outskirts of Sydney. Another example, there's a 100-mile strip of land running about 500 miles along Southern California's coast that encompasses the San Diego to Sacramento megagopolis, population 35 million. Every city within that strip of land is severely unaffordable, extremely high housing costs. Yet most of the land within that narrow strip is undeveloped, zoned rural. 2/3 of the 3-county LA County area is undevelopable. 80% of San Diego County is similarly zoned. The nearest developable land to San Francisco is 60 miles outside of city limits. Texans, on the other hand, don't zone. Developers can buy 10,000-acre parcels, they can put in streets and waterworks, they can sell off the lots. Various neighborhood covenants and deed restrictions prevent nuisance construction. Massive projects can be approved within a couple of weeks. The result? A 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2,200 square foot house that costs $1.5 million in San Francisco costs $230,000 in Houston. Dallas and Toronto both have 5 million inhabitants. Toronto's adjacent farmland presents no impediment to expansion of the city. However, 7,000 square kilometers of that land is dead zone greenbelt. Houses in Toronto are 4 times more expensive than houses in Dallas. Dallas is famous for its smooth-flowing traffic. Toronto suffers debilitating congestion. Dallas achieved this without urban planning. Pro-market thinkers have a blind spot when it comes to who profits the most from this contrived land famine. Free marketers see housing haves marginalizing the housing have-nots. Homeowners, in their perspective, devise land use regulations so as to inflate the values of their houses. Homeowners have nothing to gain from new developments in their neighborhoods. In fact, those new developments are going to cause their property values to fall. The victims of land use restrictions are A, first-time buyers, B, the renters. In U.S. cities that are suffering severe land containment, a quarter of the mortgagors, and those would almost all be the first-time buyers, are underwater as we speak. Between 2007 and 2015, 10 million American homes were forfeited. Dispossessions continue at a rate of about 700,000 per year. Now to the renters. Free marketers acknowledge that tenants suffer monetarily from land use restrictions, but they spare not a word for where that money goes. Landlordism is the forbidden fruit on the tree of knowledge. Dozens of reports from these think tanks exclusively denouncing land use regulations, and you will not see the word landlord or rent appear. Some official stats. Of America's 135 million households, 84 million, or 64%, are owner-occupied. 49 million, or 36%, are rented. Monthly rents average around $1,000, and there's a national vacancy rate of around 7%. These statistics cry out for adjustment. Every country in the Anglosphere has wide swaths of land where there's dying towns and cities, where housing is very cheap, where the vacancy rates are very high. Pressing these into a mythical average really warps the frame for what is really going on in the growing areas of the sphere. New Yorkers are 51% tenant. Los Angelinos are 52% tenant, as soon will be 60% of Londoners. Even those figures overestimate home ownership rates. Illegal immigrants in illegal suites fly far below the statistician's radar. As well, the very concept of household is becoming problematic in a world where there is so much forced cohabitation and homelessness and institutionalization, etc. National vacancy rates in the USA and elsewhere are far higher than the sort of vacancy rates you get in the big cities. Vancouver, Canada, less than 1% vacancy rates, and it's been that way for a long time. In the San Diego, Sacramento megagopoli and the New Boston to Washington megagopolis, a quarter of Americans live there. Vacancy rates very low. Also, the national averages in no way reflect prices that people are paying in the big cities. In both San Francisco and New York right now, one-bedroom apartments are going for $3,300 a month. Where are we? Rental unit construction is being thwarted by a myriad of zoning regulations, density restrictions, minimum lot sizes, parking requirements, etc. These regulations, in combination with the high land costs, which are being caused by restrictions in urban containment, resulting in very high, sky-high rents for any new residential construction that is being built, and not very much of it is being built. The San Diego, Sacramento megagopolis has got probably 8 million rental households. They are probably paying on average over $2,000 per unit. So the question is this: how much more are these residential landlords raking in than they would be but for these land restriction policies? 20 million American households are paying over a third of their income in rent. 11 million American households are paying over half their income in rent. 2 million have missed a rent payment in the last 3 months, and half of them have received eviction notices. As rents soar, so does the practice of chopping up residential houses, single-family houses, and their garages into these multi-unit rabbit warrens. Over 1 million American houses now no longer have full kitchen or bathroom facilities. This rogue landlord phenomenon is also rampant in Britain. Thus, we can say that residential landlords are profiting handsomely from restrictive land use policies. There's another group which is profiting perhaps even more, and that's the commercial property landlords. There are different definitions of commercial property. Some people define it as any revenue that generates any property that generates revenue, which would include farmland. Most investors confine the term commercial property to urban land. They tend to also include the larger residential apartment blocks in their definition. Everybody's definition of commercial property includes the office towers, the shopping malls, the industrial parks, the warehouses, what have you. These are the sorts of buildings that are used for retail stores, factories, hotels, motels, restaurants, gymnasiums, casinos, medical offices, etc. In the modern big city, probably 90-95% of all businesses rent their business premises from a private landlord. There are very few estimates as to the overall size of the commercial property market. One comprehensive study was published in 2010. They included residential apartment blocks in their definition of commercial property. They excluded parking lots, and they excluded the millions of individual houses and condos that are in the rental pool. They also relied on 2009 data, which was the bottom of a real estate cycle. Nevertheless, their estimate was that the U.S. commercial property market was worth more than $11 trillion at a time when all the companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange had a combined value of around $12 trillion. So it gives you an idea of the scale, of the size of the commercial property market. Tight land policies drive up business costs across the board. Office space is several times more expensive than it would be but for these restrictive land use policies. Land-intensive manufacturing operations are fleeing England and parts of America, Canada, for countries where the land prices are a lot cheaper. Despite commercial property's economic importance, despite the fact that it functions in the same way other forms of real estate do as regards to land supply, there is no discussion of commercial property within the free market literature. Who then drives the restrictive land use agenda? Homeowners or landlords? It's complicated because as many as 4 or 5% of homeowners do own some rental properties. So there's an overlap there. Generally speaking, however, homeowners are this vast, unorganized, apolitical mass that is often very conflicted regarding land use policy. Homeowners include a lot of first-time buyers that aren't going to make it. Homeowners include a lot of people who are employed in the construction industry that is suffering suppression as the result of these restrictive land use policies. And there's a lot of small business owners who are also homeowners, and they are paying exorbitant amounts for their business premises. In the landlord's lair, we find the big money, the old money, we find a lot of sovereign investment funds, and notably we find a lot of public sector pension fund managers. Such people employ professional lobbyists and public relations experts. While the media often hypes up the fierce local opposition to this or that real estate development, closer inspection will show that the petitions, the litigation, are the handiwork of operatives employed by environmentalist NGOs, well-funded ones at that. Landlords know how to lay low and hire environmentalists to rally local homeowners to appear as the public face for urban containment. Rationales for urban containment are things like farmland or soil conservation, green space or wilderness preservation, smart growth and climate change. These are all ecological arguments. Ecologists have codified their opposition to the commodification of land into a religious dogma. The posting itself lists a few quotes where they do this. They speak as though land should in no circumstance be treated like any other commodity. It is something completely different that must be protected from market forces. The climate hoax in particularly benefits big land. America's climate plan before Trump plan to sacrifice an area of privately owned land larger than the state of Texas, in parcels spread out across the country. This land would be leased by the private owners to the renewable energy companies, the wind farms, solar farms, what have you, or the private landowner would own the generating facilities themselves. Biofuel programs, which are part of every country's climate policies, are mountainous bonfires of food, which criminally drive up the price of food and, of course, the price of land. Climate-friendly building retrofits are paid for either by direct subsidies to or tax breaks for building owners, or they're paid for by shifting the cost of the retrofitting to the tenants. The owner of the building gets an energy-saving building, and the taxpayers and tenants get the tab. A lot of major CO2 emitters purchased carbon credits by government decree. These credits often consist of programs that prevent the clearing of forests and jungles and what have you. And this is the age-old conservationist agenda at work. An even more egregious carbon sink program pays farmers to revert their land back into scraggle bush. Urban densification or smart growth does not deliver the fuel efficiencies as advertised. It does astronomically drive up core urban land prices. Bottom line is that farmlands should be allowed to aggressively expand into the hinterland. Cities should be allowed to disperse guilt-free into the surrounding farmland. You can get these arguments developed in far greater detail on a recent posting called "The Dictatorship of the Landlords: The Green Roots of the Housing Crisis" at www.ecofascism.com.